Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is DESYNC? I took a look at this at PAX last year, I believe, so there's a bit of a preview there. The final version is now released on Steam. It's by a little group called the Foregone Syndicate and published by Adult Swim, who have a pretty good track record on PC up to this point of putting out some pretty interesting games. There's also a fairly common theme with most Adult Swim titles. They have a tendency to be fiendishly difficult. Now, I imagine that that is probably by design. They go out of their way to find these very tricky games, and they curate, and that's what they decide to publish. Nothing wrong with that. It's good to have a particular publisher identity. And DESYNC is no exception when it comes to fiendish difficulty. And that will most likely be the focus of this video. One of the most difficult and risky critiques I think you can ever make of a video game. We'll be talking about that a little bit later on. But first things first, this game is a first-person shooter with a techno aesthetic here. You might be seeing a little bit of Tron. Here. It's extremely neon. And it's also extremely glitchy by design. You'll notice things jumping all over the place. It uses a lot of interlacing, it uses CRT effects, it uses chromatic aberration, and all sorts of things like that. Some of that, I must say, at least in my eyes, or indeed to my eyes, is slightly obnoxious. Now, I understand the aesthetic they're going for here, and they seem to accomplish it quite well, but every now and again, I find the aesthetic bothersome, even with interlacing reduction turned on. If I turn that off, it gets even worse, and it sometimes makes some of the text a little bit difficult to read. For those, of course, who are a little sensitive to flashing lights and strobe effects, etc., this game may very well be painful or perhaps dangerous to play, so just bear that in mind. It does give you that warning at the start. Video options, not really a lot to talk about here, other than the fact you've got a field of view slider that goes all the way up to 140, which is a lot of FOV. I appreciate that one. Anti-aliasing, shadow distance, and so on and so forth. The game performs fairly well, although I have noticed the occasional little bit of hitching, as if there are a few frame pacing issues on certain levels. Found this particularly in the first boss arena, for whatever reason. Don't really know what's going on with that. Separate audio sliders. System right here, which is going to give you some options for your UI, such as auto weapon swap, weapon alignment, your label opacity, and all sorts of things like that, as well as notifications for rivalries. There's a lot of score attack element to be found here. Leaderboards and so on and so forth. The game encourages you to do multiple playthroughs of levels, and indeed, the game also gives you the option to do aberrant versions of those levels, which are, let's just say, more difficult and more varied. They have a bunch of mutators and different conditions going on. Has a lot of replayability, no doubt. Now, the controls. So, there's a bit of a problem with the way that the controls are set up by default, and that is the primary and secondary fire buttons for your offhand weapon. Now, most of the time, you're not going to be too worried about this because you don't have your offhand all that often. It's an item that you gain by building up an energy meter and then collecting a pickup, which activates the offhand for a limited amount of time. Now, by default, primary and secondary fire offhand are Q and E. Now, if you think about it for a second, bearing in mind this is a circle strafey kind of arena shooter using WASD and the mouse for aiming, unless you have very strange hands, I would suggest that reaching Q and E without taking your fingers off the appropriate directional button is a challenge, to say the least. So I would recommend rebinding these. I decided to go with left alt and mouse 3. That seemed like the way to go, considering that would leave my hands free, but the default binding for this is not optimal. You can use it, but it's going to involve you moving your hands from either left or right strafe in order to hit Q or E, which means that, of course, you'll stop moving in a particular direction. You never want the fire buttons interfering with the movement buttons. Unfortunately, I don't really know of a better option there. Depends, I suppose, on what you can reach. But there you go. At least you do have the rebind option anyway. Alright. That's pretty much about it for the options menu, so let's jump into the game and I'll show you a little bit of DESYNC. I've beaten the first boss, which actually puts me in a rather elite group of only 16% of players When I said this game was hard, I wasn't kidding. Only 16% of people on Steam that own this game have the achievement for beating the first boss. It takes about an hour to reach the first boss, assuming that you are not constantly restarting, which is entirely possible, since, as I said, this game is no easy feat by any means. Alright, welcome to DESYNC and its little hub world right here. I don't know who built this, but let's just say they were a little bit out of the ordinary when it came to their architectural design. As to what's actually going on in this game, I'm going to be honest, I couldn't tell you. In all of the time that I've spent playing it, there doesn't appear to be any story, any lore of any sort, outside of some vague text introduction which didn't really explain what was going on. I don't really know why that is, but hey, this is more of a mechanically focused game than it is a story-driven one. Now, this hub serves a variety of purposes. If I take this elevator, yes, that is an elevator, down, I will be able to access both a terminal, which contains a bunch of tutorial information, and the various levels of the game. Why exactly they didn't just put everything in one place, I don't really know. It's something of a waste of time in my eyes, considering that you've got a lot of your useful terminals up here. Now, if you access this terminal, you can equip what's called a core. This allows you to charge up core energy and use it as an activatable ability. I currently have 3 of them. One is a health core, user attack speed, and user weapon stagger. Could have any of those, if I so wish. I can also configure my sidearm. There appear to be 4 unlockable sidearms. I currently have 2 of them, and they can also be upgraded by achieving these challenges here. I use the collar cross, which is a little freezing crossbow, which is quite nice. And you, again, charge up energy for that, and then activate a pickup to use it for a limited time. Shard selection. This is a weapon upgrade system, which allows you to unlock these little boxes right here, which will allow you to install a shard, which has a benefit and a disadvantage. So, in this case, I have this speed shard right here for my pistol, but while that increases the speed of my projectiles, it is decreasing my fire rate. That may very well be something I want to swap out, if I so desire. In this case, that's plus damage and minus degrade. I have to admit, I don't fully understand what degrade is. I think it's got something to do with the amount of ammunition that a weapon uses. It's got this kind of energy bar related thing going on when it comes to the ammo. So-called degradation, which is apparently automatically repaired. Again, that's not very well explained. I don't recall that from the tutorial. If it was there, then I must have forgotten. But this whole aspect of repairing weapons is something you can do. I think it's just an allegory for reload, especially considering repair is on R. I think it's got something to do with that. Now, you also have the ability to have a look at your so-called attack sequences. Now, this is a key component of the game. It's a key mechanic. It's what the whole thing's based on. These attack sequences are quite similar to skill shots in the game Bulletstorm, and they involve doing what's basically a special move. And if you execute it, it will give you a benefit of some sort. Something like extra damage, or maybe it'll drop some health or some ammunition for you. And every time you do it, it will gain you extra points. So in the case of these ones, these are simple skill shots or attack sequences. They give you 500 extra points when you do them. If you stagger an enemy and then kill them with a headshot while they're staggered, you get mercy. I can't pronounce that. That's what happens when you dissolve an enemy in liquid by knocking them into like lava or whatever. If I have a look at aggressor, forward dash, and then a close range enemy kill. All that sort of thing. Knock them into a swinging axe. Kill them with the secondary fire of the pistol. That's a good way of getting extra ammo. And then you've got some more complex stuff, such as advanced. That involves having the enemy linger airborne, knock them into the air, and then kill them while they're airborne. Don't know what that is. That's something that I haven't unlocked yet. There's quite a few of these so-called attack sequences, and you discover them effectively by accident. When you accidentally pull one off, it will pause the game momentarily, tell you what you did and how to do it, and then it will record it here. This is a key component of the game, and if you're not doing these things, you're going to have a very, very bad time. Trust me on this. You can also imbue certain attack sequences with the ability to desync an enemy, hence the title of the game. These syncs are basically buffs for the enemy. The red sync is strength. The yellow sync is velocity. There's a blue sync as well, which for some reason hasn't been added to this yet. I can't remember quite what that does, but obviously you don't really want to be taking hits from the strength enemies. What you can do to desync them, though, is you can take one of these attack sequences and imbue the desync with that. And you might be saying, what the hell are you even talking about? Yeah, understandably a little bit confusing. What it means is that if you execute that attack sequence on a synced enemy, it will desync them. That means take their buff away and deal massive damage. Usually enough to kill them. The problem with this is that a lot of the attack sequences actually involve killing the enemy. Otherwise, they're not executed. This means that there aren't actually that many desync opportunities with most of these abilities. Because what's the point in desyncing an enemy if they're already dead? Well, there really isn't one. I believe you do get a bonus to your recharge speed and damage as you continue to do things like this. There's a couple of bars up to the top of the screen that you'll see once we get into a level, but there are very limited uses for this functionality. But it's pretty damn important, especially with the big tougher synced enemies. So in this case, with the red one, I've got Evader, which means evade an enemy attack and then do enemy damage. If I do that to a red synced enemy, it will deal massive damage and remove their red sync, probably killing them outright. Very good way of getting rid of them. But it may very well be later in the game that I end up unlocking a bunch more attack sequences that are more suitable to this kind of thing. But I could barely find 3 or 4 attack sequences that don't involve killing the enemy outright. So it's not massively useful. Unless I'm missing a key part of that mechanic, it doesn't really make a great deal of sense. Simply because of how limited the number of sequences you can use for that desync functionality are. Alright, we're going to head down here. And then you will see the level select. And then we'll get into a little bit of this arena combat. And you'll see exactly what I mean by these attack sequence kills and the way that the game plays out. And then we'll talk a little bit about the game's difficulty. Because that is going to be the sticking point for a lot of people. And it's also going to be the sticking point for me. And frankly, I hate criticizing game difficulty. Because it's extremely easy, unbelievably easy, to dismiss somebody's criticism with the term get good. And that's actually what's been happening on the DESYNC forums quite a bit. When people have been complaining about certain issues that they perceive with the game, the responses from the fans are get good, get good. Well, I'm going to tell you why I don't think get good applies to certain parts of this game. By the way, I was talking about that terminal. I don't really know why you even have to go to a terminal for this. It would make more sense to have this accessible all the time. Not really sure why you have to come down here and do it. You see the current playtime I've got is just about 2 hours. The number of levels completed and all sorts of things like that. A lot of statistics available, which is great, by the way. I love the fact that there are so many statistics. Absolutely crazy. And then you also have all of these system messages which give you guidance to the various mechanics and pieces of functionality in the game. You can see, this is what the sync does. By the way, as I mentioned, not very easy to read, is it? Yeah, not a huge fan of it. This distortion effect is just a pain in the arse when it comes to reading this information. That aesthetic choice actually impedes the ability to digest that information comfortably, which is, in my opinion, not a very good idea. Okay. We're going to jump into a level, and I'll show you exactly what's going on with DESYNC and the kind of gameplay that you can expect. Alright. This is the zone selection, whatever the heck that is. If you right-click while standing in this area, it will allow you access to the various levels. Now, I understand aesthetic and stylistic choices. I am not the world's biggest fan of this one, I have to admit. It looks neat, but frankly, a menu would have been more helpful. There's just little elements of this hub world that are unnecessarily inconvenient for the sake of the artistic vision of the developer. Anyway, it's not the world's biggest deal. I'm just, again, not a huge fan of it. So these are levels that I've unlocked. That was the first boss that I beat. And then you have aberration versions of these levels that you can unlock. These aberrations are very interesting because they give you a bunch of replayability options. Essentially, they have challenges and mutators and different enemy spawns. So I could do approach with aberration mode on, and every time I beat a wave, it would put a different mutator on. So maybe it would disable my ability to dash, or increase the fire rate of all my weapons, and so on and so forth. I'll show you one of those in a little bit. But in the meantime, let's dive into this mission, which I have yet to be, called Biomineral. And I'll demonstrate the mechanics of the game, which are, by every possible measurable metric, its strength, since there really isn't much of a story to go for or anything along those lines, and there really isn't a lot of world building either, from what I can tell. Alright, so welcome to very stylish and, in my opinion, very cool looking level, no doubt about that. And here come the enemies, simple as that. So your mission is quite simple. Murder them. And where possible, try and get some skill shots. You'll have noticed there that I knocked that guy back into that molten lava pillar, which was a skill shot, and that allowed me to get a few extra points. So I'm going to get rid of that. There we go. Now, you might notice that I'm taking a lot of damage. I'm going to shake these guys off here. That's the only way to get rid of them. The game never tells you that, by the way. I spent a couple of attempts trying to figure out why I was constantly dying to those little things. But yeah, you literally have to shake those big bugs off. So the game is quite simple in the sense that you are tasked with killing everything in the area before moving on to the next area. So a little bit of painkiller going on there. It's maybe a decent way to look at it. And you are scored based on how well you did. If you die during a wave, you will respawn at the start of that wave in order to attempt it again. When you do eventually beat it, assuming that you eventually beat it, you will be scored and you'll be penalized if you had to respawn, unsurprisingly. So, at the moment I have 3 different weapons. There are about 8 or so in the game, I believe. And again, they are all upgradable. They all have regular and alt fires. The shotgun's quite interesting. The regular fire is exactly what you'd expect. However, that is the secondary fire, which is a shuriken that sort of sits on the ground and does damage. It's a trap. And that's one of the special abilities, one of those attack sequences. If I send one of these enemies back into it, then I'll get the entrapment special, which is a nice little bonus there. This guy is not nice whatsoever. I'm going to try and take his shield down if possible. And once you start to get the rhythm and the hang of it, you are going to, I imagine, very much enjoy pulling off those attack sequences, and you are getting benefits. We've got the overkill meter over there and the attack meters. They're all getting buffed up as a result of all of this. I'm going to grab our little rocket launcher. And dead. Never mind. The gunplay in general, I think, is pretty satisfying, assuming that you are pulling off these attack sequences on a regular basis and you are not using the wrong weapon on the wrong target. If you are, and you're not using the benefit of attack sequences, you might find some of the enemies a little bit spongy. But honestly, if you're using your environment correctly, like that, and you're using the right weapons and you're aiming, then you shouldn't really have too many problems with anything outside of the bosses. Most of the enemies die pretty fast, and you start to get into this nice little rhythm, taking into account things like resource and ammo conservation, trying to use your environment in the best way possible to eliminate enemies and get bonus points, and also force them to spawn additional health and ammunition. So far, so good, right? Well, the issue that the game is going to have for a lot of people, myself included, is the level of difficulty. Now, from what I can tell, I think I understand the principles of most of the mechanics. I understand the idea of desyncing an enemy, although it's quite tricky to do so, as I mentioned earlier, since there aren't that many attack sequences you can really use for it. I understand the process of using attack sequences to force the enemy to drop extra ammunition and charge up my energy bars and give myself bonus damage and regen, all that sort of thing. I understand the principles of all of those things. So really, as long as you understand the principles of those things, then what is there left to do other than get good, right? Well, the problem with getting good is that the design of certain enemies in this game goes beyond difficult. It goes to the point of, in my opinion, being flat out unfair. Now let me try and justify this before you try and burn me at the stake for being some sort of filthy casual. So my justification for this is as follows. Quite a few enemies in this game use melee attacks. Now these melee attacks have barely any telegraph to them whatsoever, and they tend to deal massive damage. Now you might be thinking, alright, well just stay away from them then. Sounds good. Now what if I told you that things like that can happen? What if I told you that since the game doesn't have a radar or anything along those lines and no audio indication as to where an enemy actually is, it's quite easy to be flanked and obliterated before you can even react. You do have this dodge, and this dodge will certainly allow you to avoid those melee attacks if you know that they're coming. And therein sort of lies the biggest problem. More often than not, you don't know that they're coming. Now, let's compare this to a game like Dark Souls. Now, there's your quintessential comparison of the get good game. Most of the complaints made about Dark Souls difficulty can be answered by, it's hard but it's fair, and you will learn how to deal with these challenges. And it will be satisfying to do so. So really, you should just be patient and get good. The thing about Dark Souls is that it's a third-person game with full camera control, and it's pretty easy to keep everything within your field of vision, assuming that you control the camera correctly. This is not true in a first-person shooter. No matter how wide you make that field of view, the maximum is 140, that's still more than half of the level that you're not going to be able to see at any given time. No, I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, when you combine that with some enemies' tendency to flank you, or indeed, in some cases, literally teleport behind you and stab you in the back for more than half of your HP, you have a recipe for frustration. Now, when I took on the first boss, it took me quite some time to kill him. I did beat him, thankfully, but it took a while. This was a very melee-focused boss. He had a few ranged attacks, projectiles. Those weren't the problem. Now, it's quite easy to keep an eye on projectiles and dodge them, because they're not hit scan, they're all movable projectiles, so they're not really all that tricky to handle. Got no problem with that. No problem with dodging projectiles. It's entirely reasonable. It's something that has been part of many a classic first-person shooter. Why would you want rid of that? Those are fine. It's the melee attacks that I have an issue with. They're so fast. They barely telegraph whatsoever, and there is an additional problem. You know why most first-person shooters do not attempt first-person platforming, at least in my opinion? It's because it's really hard to do well. And the reason it's quite hard to do well is that it's more difficult to judge distance in a first-person shooter than it is in a third-person or 2D side-scroller. That means that it's very easy to misjudge your jump distance and die. That is not enjoyable gameplay. That is extremely frustrating indeed for most people. Which is why most first-person shooters tend to avoid that sort of thing. Now, the same principle applies here, especially when it comes to things like melee swings. It's quite hard to judge the distance of a melee swing, especially considering how fast they're coming at you. So even if you do see it coming, you don't necessarily end up dodging out of the way in time. You could dodge to the side and believe that you have dodged out of the range of the melee weapon, but in reality, you may very well not have done so, and then there goes half your life almost immediately. Not particularly pleasant. So there's those combinations of nasty little elements which make this game, in my opinion, far more difficult than it really has any right to be. It's all down to that melee. You can't keep everything in the field of view in a first-person shooter. Not possible. There are no audio warnings, there are no UI warnings that something is coming up behind you or coming up to the side of you. And considering the amount of damage these melee dudes can do, you will end up dying far more than is comfortable or justifiable, in my honest opinion. Is that fixable? Is that a game killer? Is it a deal breaker? I mean, it's definitely what's caused the majority of my frustration in this game. There's no doubt about that. I've had a decent amount of patience for restarting encounters and trying things again, because honestly, the gunplay, for the most part, is actually so damn enjoyable, and it's very fun to manipulate my environment and learn new attack sequences in order to destroy my opponents, that I've been willing to put up with the restarts. But I have to admit that it is the source of a lot of frustration for me. And that's also compounded by level design, which seems to have an unhealthy fascination with bottomless pits, spike traps, swinging axes, and insta-kill lava, which is not only in the ground, but also on the wall. If I run into that, I will instantly die. Now, keeping track of all of those things in a fast-moving game while you're trying to circle strafe around an arena, most of which you cannot see at any given time, is extremely challenging, and honestly, I don't care how good you are going to be making those mistakes. You will. Doesn't matter how good you are. In a game like Dark Souls, you can keep an eye on those things because you can see the entire battle arena on your screen at any given time. This is not Dark Souls, this is a first-person shooter, and you can't do that. That's why, as far as I'm concerned, the difficulty of this game is, in some instances, unfair. And it's a real shame to say that, because I actually really enjoy the core mechanics that are going on right here, and I want to progress, unlock new weapons, discover new combos. I heard there's a weapon that does the shot combo in the game, so that's a nice little bit of nostalgia there. I want to discover these crazy new enemy types and sort out all of my upgrades and see what the bosses have to offer. But the game is so damn difficult as a result. Jesus, that was almost 100% to nothing in an instant. One mistake and that's it, with so little margin for error. There's so much of that going on that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get over that difficulty hump. That's one of the big challenges of critiquing video games, of course. They are not books. They will stop you from progressing if you're not good enough. And I'm up for a challenge. But in this case, I do believe that there is a fairly strong degree of unfairness going on. And I've given you my justification for that. You may very well disagree with me. But it's something that I have to remark on one way or the other. And I hate remarking on it, because I'm always so scared that I'm blaming the game for something that's my fault. I don't really think that that's the case in this instance. And I've hopefully given you decent justification as to why. I think you can see the logic behind it. I hope so, at any rate. I certainly wouldn't want to be unduly or unfairly punishing towards the developer for something that is actually my fault. That isn't fair whatsoever. Not a fan of that. Oh, Christ. Slow him down. There we go. Get that nice little coolant buff on there. I think we'll actually finally make our way through this sequence. Assuming I don't fall down a pit. So what could be done to solve that problem? Well, I honestly think that it's not that difficult to solve. You don't have to solve all of it either. Just solving a fraction of it would probably be enough to dial the frustration level back. I think that the melee enemies should telegraph their attacks more than they do. Some are okay, some not so much. I think that the game should be forgiving when it comes to the range and the reach of these weapons. I recall reading an article a while ago on a platform, it may very well have been Mario or Sonic or something along those lines, where the developer described the fact that they designed the game to be quite forgiving when it comes to narrowly missing a platform. To the point where if you did narrowly miss a platform, the game would realize it, and it would let you have it anyway. It would essentially give you just that tiny little bit of auto-correction, that little bit of margin for error. And they did this because it made the game far more satisfying and less frustrating to play. You could, I think, very easily do that. Ooh, cool, we got the shock rifle. Let's go. I think you could very easily do that here. I've noticed the opposite when it comes to that level of tolerance and that margin for error, particularly during the first boss fight. There was so little tolerance. Let's try and do the shot combo, eh? There you go. Shot combo. Very nice. There was so little margin for error and tolerance that I found myself getting hit by the weapon despite the fact that I was almost certain that I hadn't. Looking at the screen, seeing that swing, which is difficult to perceive considering how fast it is, I was like, there's no way that actually hit me. You could make the hitboxes just a little bit more generous in that respect. Another alternative would be to give you more warnings as to when melee attacks were coming in, particularly if enemies had teleported behind you or flanked you. These are synced enemies, by the way, so I'm probably going to get wrecked. I can't even remember what my desync is for these guys. There we go. Some sort of UI warning that an attack is coming your way, or indeed an audio warning. There's very little of that. Enemies don't make a huge amount of noise when they attack you. Of course, the very easy fix would just be, again, more telegraphing. Or retool some of the enemies so they're not meleeing as much. I just don't really feel that melee is a particularly good idea in a first-person shooter for the most part, because it is so very, very easy to lose track of an enemy and then get horribly murdered by it. I mean, you could just knock the damage level down, perhaps, on the melee-based enemies. That would probably work fairly well, too. I don't mind dodging projectile-based attacks, but as I said, those melee attacks, they're a pain. If you did any of those things, I think if they rebalanced the game, maybe created an easier difficulty level. There's no difficulty mode in this game at all, by the way. You're stuck with whatever they give you. If they did something with that, that might do the trick, maybe. Maybe. Of course, some of the veteran players of this game are probably saying, well, that would just ruin it. Maybe. But, as I said, I've had some great times with this game and really enjoyed the principles of the attack sequences. I mean, it's one of the things that I loved about Bulletstorm. Not that this game, of course, has the charm of Bulletstorm by any stretch. It doesn't really have a story or voice acting or anything to speak of, or really even any world building, honestly. But mechanically, I found it very, very enjoyable. I've just been held back so very, very much by this level of frustration that's been going on. I just want to be less frustrated. I want the game to feel fairer. Very nice, there we go. Because when it does play well, and when you do get into the rhythm, it's extremely enjoyable. It's a big challenge, an enjoyable challenge, but pulling off all of these different moves and causing enemies to explode with loot drops and all that sort of thing, and seeing the extra score bonuses fly at your face is an extremely satisfying experience. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a ton of replayability as well. Let's jump out of this so that I can show you these aberrant or aberration levels. As I mentioned that you could replay the levels in different ways. Well, you absolutely can do that. So let me dive in here and show you what I mean. Unfortunately, it does mean we're going to have to go all the way back. Again, a little bit annoying, a little bit pointless, but hey. I could also upgrade my weapon while I'm here, couldn't I? There's the diometer, I believe is the name of it. Oh no, the polyhedron, that's it. Initialize that. Well, it looks like we can increase that. We can generate a new anti-degradation shard if we so desire. And just install that. There we go. Cool. Little upgrade. Very nice. Let me show you this alternate level right here. Of course, if you're the sort of person that's very much into score attack, then the amount of leaderboards and the ability to have rivalries with people online is pretty great. Alright, let's show you one of these aberrant or aberration zones. Now, if I head on over to Necropolis, this is one that I've done previously. And the way that this works is it gives you a preset gear loadout and a set of mutator challenges as you go through the level. So it's a different way to play it, a different experience, and often it results in some pretty riotous consequences. In this case, this level starts you off with dual pistols. Pistols akimbo. And once you've chewed your way through the first set of enemies, and by the way, doing this is actually extremely enjoyable, you will move on to the next area and be given another mutator, and so on and so forth. Now, these levels are designed mostly, I think, for score attack play. Again, they have their own separate leaderboards, and since everyone has exactly the same loadout and setup, it provides a fairly balanced and fair challenge. And I have actually beaten this one before. I just need to, not suck. That would be good. And it's really enjoyable to chew through these enemies. The other level that I've unlocked gives you the shock rifle and lets you dual wield that, which is absolutely bonkers. You even get those bonus points for ambidextrous kills as well. So tons of attack sequences being fired off there. And a grade S for that. Very nice. Let me make sure I don't blow myself up. If you want to see your meters go high, well, this is the mode to do it in. This is the second mutator. User cannot dash, so we don't have the ability to do that now. Which is a little unfortunate, but hey. And you'll continue to play through the challenge until the end, and then you'll get your ranked score. You can also get extra shards from doing these levels as well, so it's worth it to upgrade for the main campaign. So, after looking at all that, what's my conclusion on DESYNC? Right. The reality is that I really enjoy this as a mechanical challenge. I think the mechanics are very well designed, and there's a lot of challenge that is derived from that attack sequence system. Once you really start to learn those attack sequences, when to use them and how to combo them together for bonus points, there's a lot of depth there, and it's very enjoyable and extremely satisfying. The gunplay is pretty slick, it's quite tight. The weapons feel suitably varied, and I'm looking forward to trying a few more of them out. Combine that with the dash and the ability to dodge out of the way, and you've got a highly kinetic, challenging first-person shooter experience. That is, in my eyes, currently hamstrung by unbalanced difficulty. As I said before, quite a bit of the challenge is fair, and some of it isn't. And a lot of that comes down to these melee-focused enemies, and the fact that it is a first-person shooter making you incapable of keeping track of all of the enemies in the arena. Since there is no UI indicator outside of a very brief arrow that's pointed to synced enemies as they spawn, it's very easy to get backstabbed, it's very easy to get flanked and almost instantly killed. Not to mention that even if you face down a melee enemy, the telegraphing is so minor that dodging isn't all that easy anyway. You have to know that it's coming. And once the swing starts, it's pretty much too late. And even then, it may very well not be okay, simply because the reach of many of the weapons and the hitboxes are deceiving and could do with being a little bit more generous. That is fixable. That could be balanced in future patches, and I kind of hope that they add an easier mode, honestly, so that people can enjoy the game frustration-free. I admit that I've had a fairly high tolerance for the difficulty of the game, but there have definitely been moments where I've just shouted out, this is BS. There's no way that this is remotely reasonable, fair, or in any way enjoyable. That's what's going to hold the game back for some people, myself included. Hey, if you think you're up to the challenge, great. Give it a try. Be one of the only 16% that have even beaten the first boss in this title. If you think it's just about getting good, then by all means, have a blast. Feel free. You don't have to show your gameplay to the world. We do. I think my criticisms of the difficulty are fair and reasonable, and as far as I can tell, I have a pretty strong understanding of the mechanics, at least up to this point. I'm more than willing to be proven wrong, but when enemies do things like this, I think that's a tad unreasonable, to say the least. If they can fix that, I think it'll be a much more enjoyable experience. As it stands, though, I've had a good 70% fun combined with 30% frustration. We'll see what they decide to do with balancing the game in future updates. DESYNC, ladies and gentlemen, available for $15, your regional equivalent on Steam. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And I'll see you next time.